Hi everyone, Eric here. I want to encourage you to become an all-access subscriber to the China Africa Project. With your subscription, you'll get the China Africa Brief, which is our daily email newsletter, plus unlimited access to the China Africa Experts Network and all of our exclusive analysis on our website. Just go to chinaafricaproject.com/subscribe and enter the promo code podcast for an extra month free at checkout. Once again, that's chinaafricaproject.com/subscribe.
The China and Africa podcast is brought to you in partnership with the Africa-China Reporting Project at Wits University in Johannesburg. The ACRP promotes balanced, considered reporting on Africa-China relations through innovative training programs held throughout the year. More information at africachinareporting.co.za.
Hello and welcome to another edition of the China in Africa podcast. I'm Eric Olander, and as always, I'm joined by Cobus van Staden, a senior China-Africa researcher at the South African Institute of International Affairs in Johannesburg, South Africa. A very good morning to you, Cobus.
Good morning.
Cobus, reaction and reflection is now setting in following last week's Russia-Africa summit, the first one that was in the Black Sea resort of Sochi. It was really a very, very interesting summit and part of the 2019 series of Africa summits. We had one earlier this year in Yokohama, Japan that you went to for the TCAD 7. There was also not quite a summit, but it was the Prosper Africa unveiling in Maputo, Mozambique from the Americans. There's the Turkish summit. There's been a number of them, and there's a number still to come. But this one was very important because it marked the revitalization of Russia's interest in Africa. The reason I say revitalization is because, well, under the Soviet era, Russia was very, very active in Africa. It's gone quiet, and now with President Vladimir Putin, he wants to be back. And by all intents and purposes, Cobus, it looked like he and his re-engagement in Africa was very, very well received by the 40 heads of states and 54 or 55 African government representatives who attended the Sochi summit.
Yes, I mean, that was a big crowd. I think it was actually more African leaders that went to TCAD, as far as I understand. So it's very interesting to see this level of interest from Africa. And, it'll be very interesting to see which specific areas of engagement will emerge. I think another question is what role a kind of a shared anti-Western sentiment is playing here, to which extent Russia is positioning itself as kind of the non-West, and then also how Russia will be positioning itself in relation to China.
Well, it's interesting because I was putting together our daily newsletter, which I hope people decide to subscribe to, and it's part of what we do every day at the China Africa Project to kind of provide what's called the China Africa Daily Brief. And I did a media brief on various reactions to it, and it seemed like we're hearing back this idea of the scramble for Africa. That was a word that was used by the Daily Nation in Kenya, the Daily Maverick, and it was very, very interesting to hear that sense. But also in the Daily Maverick in South Africa, Cobus, there was a comment by some folks at Stellenbosch in Cape Town who commented that once Africans start to see that basically Putin has a white nationalist, that highly provincial, aggressive kind of agenda, that those limitations on that anti-Western, anti-American agenda may start to run into some limits. That's something we'd like to talk about today. But really what we're going to talk about is the China angle. And there was a very, very interesting article that posted this weekend or on Friday from the Carnegie Moscow Center, Russia and China in Africa, Allies or Rivals, and it was by Vida Spivak, who's an analytics project lead for Expert RA. That's a credit ratings agency in Moscow. This is our first time going to Moscow for the show. A very good morning to you, Vita.
Hello. Good to hear you.
Well, it's excellent to be able to get a Russian perspective on the Russia-Africa summit, and particular to focus on your article that talked about whether Russia and China have conflicting or complementary interests in Africa. I think it should go without saying that really the two are not direct competitors in the sense that Russia is an economy that's smaller than the state of California. China is the second largest economy in the world. Clearly, they're not matched in terms of economic power, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they won't run into each other as rivals or necessarily cooperate with each other, as Cobus alluded to, as anti-Western or anti-American allies. So why don't you make the case for us a little bit on allies or rivals, Russia and China in Africa?
Thank you so much for taking an interest in my piece. I have been thinking about that for a while now, and what strikes me most is, for starters, is the American Africa strategy that was published a year ago. And there, Russia and China is like two non-democratic states who are close between themselves. We have been seeing a very rapid geopolitical rapprochement between those two. And they are automatically put together in Africa, where, sort of Western influence has been declining comparatively in the last few years. And that strikes me the most because they automatically are put on the one side of the barricade as if they are teaming up together in this region as well to sort of challenge the Western influence. And in my view, essentially, there is no such thing as any kind of teaming up at the moment. I do not see any kind of evidence to that. But what I see, and many analysts in Russia who watch Russia-China cooperation in various regions in the world, it is basically seen that Russia is seizing opportunities in Africa that do not require too much commitment, but bring immediate results. And what they're doing is that they're selling weapons and they sort of promoting certain diplomatic push in order to enhance some kind of diplomatic and geopolitical influence. And these opportunities, they are offered by good relationship with China. And Beijing right now basically allows Russia to develop its presence in the region where China itself is present in various forms and very vastly. And this is also offered by the relative decline of the Western presence in the region. And it is all comes down to selling weapons and getting immediate practical profit from that and unnerving the West. And this is essentially what Moscow has been trying to do for several years now, considering all the sanctions and all the geopolitical isolation that has been happening to that since the Ukrainian crisis evolved. But if we're talking about the weight of Russia and China in Africa, obviously in the economic sense, Russia doesn't have the power or any kinds of means to outbid Chinese influence in the region, obviously. But we can see certain similarities, for example, when it comes to Chinese loans or investments in Africa. It doesn't really come with any kind of transparency or anti-corruption conditions. And when it comes to Russian arms sales to the region, it doesn't really come off with any kind of limitations in that sense. And this is what is somewhat welcome by the African states. This is what I'm seeing, that they are kind of welcoming that sense that Russian influence in the region is coming with no strings attached. But what I'm seeing as well is that China is sort of set to become a more responsible player in the region, and it is trying to become a mediator in different areas where there is conflict or there are tensions. And here where I can see Russian and Chinese interests might potentially clash in the future, because Russia, with its opportunistic stance that basically we have the weapons and we will sell that to anyone, to any side of a conflict, that might create a certain difficulties for Chinese economic interest in the region or its positioning as a responsible power in the area. So this is where I see that in the future that might be some kind of a clash.
So, Vita, the Chinese influence in Africa, is run by a number of separate but related players, including state-owned organizations, state-owned enterprises, state banks, and then a kind of a diplomatic level of engagement, coming directly from the government. What are the main players in Russia's engagement with Africa? Is there also a situation of state-owned enterprises being, kind of expanding their international experience in international markets, or is it more of a private sector and government relationship?
So as I see it, it's mostly government. It's mostly officials who are, unlike certain Western leaders, they are visiting Africa and they are meeting with African leaders. And obviously there are state-owned enterprises in Russia such as Rosatom or Rosneft, the major players of the Russian economy. But I do not see any private sector advancing in there in any kind of a tangible sense.
The United States has identified both Russia and China as its chief competitors and rivals in Africa. This came out very vocally in John Bolton's famous Heritage Foundation speech where he unveiled Prosper Africa, but it's come out by the Pentagon in a number of different ways and areas. And I guess it's interesting for me because the history between Russia and China go back, one that they've never been close. They may have overlapping agendas, but the way that the United States is framing it is that both could present a challenge, certainly on social media following the summit. A lot of Americans frame this as China and Russia teaming up in some ways to fill the political vacuum being left by the United States in a policy that is a foreign policy that is much more distracted now by Syria and the impeachment at home. So I guess I'm wondering what you think the mood in Moscow is towards China, and do they look at it at their relationship with China in a complementary or an adversarial way? And again, we cannot divorce what's happening today from a history that wasn't that long ago. I mean, it was 1989 when I was in high school, but I was still pretty young, that Gorbachev went to Beijing during, of course, the famous Tiananmen Square kind of standoff that was there. At that time, the massacre had not happened. But that was really in my lifetime when Sino-Soviet ties started to melt. So it's not that long ago when these two powers were distrustful of one another. What's the mood today? Help us kind of get an understanding from Moscow.
To start, I would like to just look back to the 21st century really quickly. And in the beginning of the 21st century, Russia didn't really look at China, and it basically missed its emergence as a young great power, because Russia was very concerned with building up ties with Europe, and all the elite was looking to the West. But as soon as the tensions started to emerge, and precisely after 2008 global crisis, Russia sort of started to look eastwards to China, and people in Moscow, they appreciated the way China coped with the financial crisis. And after 2014, after basically geopolitical isolation that took place in Moscow, China was there to help out Vladimir Putin and the Russian elite to reestablish its position in the world. And China was there to act as a partner, which Russia was seeking really desperately back then. And over the course of the last 5 years, I would say that Russia and China have grown pretty close, and there is a very multidimensional cooperation, which includes economic, trade, investment, pretty large-scale military cooperation, which unnerves many in the West and interests many in Russia. So cooperation is very strategic, and it has evolved. But I would say that it is very asymmetrical, and it is very uneven, and Russia is taking a role of a junior partner, and it is dependent on China much more than vice versa. So I would say that this is a very well-established long-term partnership, but it doesn't necessarily mean that Russia and China would act together in different areas of the world. for example, Africa.
You mentioned the role of arms trade in the Russia-Africa relationship. Can you expand on that a little bit? What kind of arms are being traded? Where are they going? And China is also an emerging significant arms trader to Africa. Do you have any sense on how the Russian and Chinese arms trade to Africa differ or overlap, or like how they might interact in the future?
For now, I think they are complementary. I think that Russian arms, they're fairly reliable and they are cheap, more or less cheap. And at the moment, I think there are 18 countries on the African continent that have signed sort of some kind of agreements with the Russian side on the arms trade. So there is a quite considerable presence there. And also there are military advisors who work, for example, in Central African Republic, and they work pretty extensively, and to the point that the personal bodyguards of the current president of the Central African Republic are Russian military officers. So there is some kind of very different forms of Russian military engagement, but the scale of it is obviously cannot really compete with China, and it is, in my sense, it basically goes upon the agreement of China. It basically allows it to happen, and it will probably happen to the extent until China is comfortable with it.
Support for this podcast comes from the Africa-China Reporting Project at Wits University School of Journalism in Johannesburg. The ACRP provides reporting grants, workshops, and other professional development opportunities for both African and Chinese journalists. Follow the ACRP on Twitter at Wits China Africa or visit africachinareporting.co.za for information about grants and upcoming seminars.
I guess I'm trying to figure out what is appealing to African countries about dealing with Russia. I know why Russia wants to be more engaged in Africa, because it allows Putin to be able to extend his influence. He's re-engaging in the Middle East. Clearly, the United States is leaving a void, and I know U.S. officials would probably argue against that, but I think the reality speaks pretty clearly as to what's happening. Donald Trump does not seem interested in the least in Africa, so there is an opening there. So I'd like to ask both of you, and I'll start with you, Cobus. I guess the part I'm struggling with is that if Russia's main export to Africa is arms, ultimately it's a destabilizing force, because the last thing that Africa needs right now is more weapons. So why do African leaders go to Moscow or go to Sochi and engage with someone like Putin with as much enthusiasm as they seem to have done? I mean, really, there were smiles all around at this summit. But he's not really bringing back much in the form of investment, in the form of, he talked about bringing nuclear energy technology and whatnot, but there really wasn't much on the table. There was no massive aid packages. The loan relief that they gave was about $20 billion from the Soviet era, and the Africans weren't going to pay back those loans anyway, because after all, that was 20, 30 years ago. Cobus, what is the incentive on the African side to be so excited about dealing with a guy like Putin and the Russians?
I share your kind of, mystification on this. Part of it, I think, relates to historical relationships, because the Soviet-Africa relationship was very strong. And obviously the Soviets were very, very influential in supporting African anti-colonial struggle. I think now, from the perspective of the 21st century, we forget how harsh those struggles were, how long they went on, and then also how in a lot of countries the colonial era and a kind of a neo-colonial era really kind of merged into each other. That after decolonization, a lot of African countries were in chaos, and then they were facing a lot of kind of pressure from the West, a lot of economic pressure from the West. So in that climate, the Soviet Union played a strong role in pushing decolonization. But I completely agree with you. Like, they don't seem to be bringing a lot to the table. And at the same time, Russia itself, domestically is starkly racist. Like China, at least, kind of, even though China has a lot of race issues with Africans, at least China can position itself as having also been colonized by Western countries, having been in some kind of kind of unhappy relationship with the, to put it in a kind of crazy way, but like in with the kind of global whiteness, kind of forces of global whiteness. Russia is, classically racist, classically in lots of ways colonial power in certain ways in Africa. So that I find also mystifying, and it makes me think that there are larger problems in the West Africa relationship than would seem on the surface. Kind of if Russia presents such a kind of welcome partner to in comparison to like the EU, even if you're leaving the Trump administration off the table, if Russia is so much more of an attractive partner to Africa than Europe, then that seems to indicate very worrying things about that relationship, I think.
I partially agree with Kobos, but I would say that probably in the sense of Africans, Russia is not as much of a colonial power as other Western countries would be, and right now Russia in the position of it basically antagonizes the West altogether, and it acts as a kind of sort of as a victim in a way, but as a victim that strikes back. And what Putin is saying about the de-dollarization or making African economies sovereign again, that all is a very sweet talk to the ears of African leaders. And this is what Putin has been saying at his meetings with Xi Jinping, for example. But it hasn't really happened, but it's all very nice talk that serves its purpose for this big event. And I think this is what they want to hear at the moment.
So I guess as an American, here I'm trying to channel my inner American, which, Kobus, is not always easy for me to do. But let's try to, if you're sitting in Washington right now and you're looking at this, you're thinking, what is going on? Because the United States remains the largest investor in Africa. It's the largest aid provider. And it really would feel like an insult, I think, to Americans to see the enthusiasm with which people like Ramaphosa and Kenyatta, who went to Sochi and embraced Putin, because at the end of the day, he's not going to provide a fraction of that. And I still can't understand, maybe it's just about sticking it to the Americans. I don't know. I mean, that doesn't make any sense. But Vita, what do you think the Americans take away from this? What does this say about the relationship between Africa and the United States and Russia and the three, and how they all sit together? As you said, Russia is really a destabilizing force in that sense vis-a-vis the Americans.
Yeah, and this is the question I'm asking myself all the time, actually. I think that American alarmism in regards to Russia, and for that matter China, is becoming sort of a overwhelming force that does not allow Washington to see clearly, to see and to estimate the actions of China, of Russia in various areas and on various issues of the international affairs. And I think that people in Washington, they overestimate the scale, the intensivity, and the level of influence that Russia can have anywhere in the world, and the scale of its friendship and its intentions with China when it comes to Africa or when it comes to Central Asia, for example. I think that this alarmism and this basically disengagement from the American side when it comes to Russia and to the Russian people, that what stops people in Washington from judging and seeing clearly.
Vita, in your previous answer, one of your previous answers, you mentioned that to a certain extent Russia has leeway to expand its connections with Africa, among others because China isn't countering it, or it is kind of like it's allowing it the space to work in places like Central African Republic and other spaces. If the relationship between Russia and China gets more tense again, like what are some of the tools in China's toolkit that it could use to counter Russia?
So I think if Chinese and Russian relationship are set to decline again, I think Africa would not be the first place that they would clash. I think it would start with such places as Central Asia or the Korean Peninsula, and Africa probably would not be the first one to witness any kind of a clash between these two powers. But obviously, China would have every instrument in its toolkit to counter Russian influence if it wants to, because of the economic scale of its presence in Africa and elsewhere in the world. And there might be certain ramifications for the politics that Russia and China take in such international organizations as the UN. So in regards to Africa right now, Russia and China are sort of acting together, but that might change if the bilateral relationship deteriorates.
Yeah, that's not a long-term relationship that I would necessarily bet on only just because of the history of what we've known from the 20th century. This has always been an uneasy relationship. Let's kind of wrap this up in terms of looking forward a little bit in the near term. There were no major promises put on the table, unlike other Africa summits including the Chinese, where there was a dollar amount or there was some commitment. Putin kept it quite kind of vague, and people kind of went away thinking, okay. I mean, even the Japanese and the Americans said we're going to lead with our private sector engagement, and there was some hope that there was going to be within the next 12 to 24 months rumblings of some things that happened coming out of those summits. What do you expect to come out of this summit last week in, say, the next year or so, besides more Russian arms making it to the continent?
Yeah, honestly, I think that depends on the economic situation in Russia, because most of the agreements that Russian companies have proclaimed during the summit, they're mostly memorandum of understandings, and that doesn't necessarily mean that they would deliver anything, and that has been the case for a long time, for example, with certain Russian companies and the Chinese side. And I'm not sure that it will bring anything more than more arms trade or more alarmism in the West, to be honest.
Wow. Okay. Well, that's a uplifting, positive note for us to end on. Vida Stivak is an analytics project lead for Expert RA, which is a credit rating agency. She's based in Moscow, and she wrote a fascinating article for the Carnegie Moscow Center, Russia and China in Africa, Allies or Rivals. Vida, are you on social media for people if they want to get in touch with you and follow what you're reading and writing these days?
Yeah, I am. I'm on Twitter and on Facebook. You can find me by my name. So, yeah, I'm there.
Excellent. Well, we will put a link to your Twitter account in the show notes. We thank you so much for taking time to speak with us about the summit and your article.
Thank you. Thank you, guys.
If I am sitting in Washington and listening to what Vida says, I got to be honest with you, I'd be a little pissed. I mean, like the fact that guys like Ramaphosa, who in his weekly email address that went out this week, where he kind of gave his reflections on what happened in Sochi, was so effusive of Putin. I would find that offensive in the sense that, what is Russia going to do for Africa? What was all this hype out there of last week? Nothing seemed to come out of it. Maybe it's just to stick the Americans in the eye. I don't know. I mean, I'm trying to figure out what's the geopolitical national security interest on the behalf of those 40 African heads of state who went there. What's their national interest for getting closer to Putin? and at the risk of isolating the Americans, who have been much more generous in aid and investment and everything else. I mean, I'm perplexed right now.
I mean, one thing I can think is that it's an attempt to kind of push back against the optics of Africa being always beholden to the West. I mean so Russia does offer one more option, and so there is this kind of embracing of that option with the embracing of options like China and the UAE and other non-Western actors. But I mean, yeah, I mean, I share your mystification. Like, it seems to me indicate to me just that the relationship, that there needs to be really serious thought put into what the symbolic role of the West is in Africa at the moment. Kind of like where the West Africa relationship really is sitting at the moment, because as you mentioned, kind of it might just be this kind of gesture of like poking the West, but then why is that gesture so necessary right now? Kind of why is it making so much political sense to the level of sending 40 heads of state to the summit? Kind of that I think is really needs unpacking. Like why has the relationship deteriorated to that extent?
And I think you have to be careful about the Russians, and they have been a very destabilizing force in the United States in terms of what they did in the 2016 election, in terms of interfering on Facebook and social media. There's been evidence that they've tried to do it in France, in Eastern Europe, in a number of different countries. And so imagine if you are a small African country getting on the wrong side of Putin and he turns his cyber armies on you, you're in a tough spot. So I'm trying to understand the logic of bringing Putin into what the benefit is of bringing Putin into beyond just arms. But arms, come on, you can get arms from a lot of different places, and you can get arms on the black market. The Americans sell a lot of arms. The Chinese clearly sell a lot of arms. That by itself is a commodity. So it's really interesting. And I thought it was interesting how upfront Vito was in it all. She was like, no, basically we sell arms and that's what we do. And there's not much more to it. I'm just trying to understand the geopolitics from the African point of view and the various African leaders. A guy like Kenyatta, Ramaphosa, Buhari out of Nigeria. What is their goal in all of this? Because Buhari's not going to sell oil to Russia.
Yes, I mean, kind of in lots of ways, Russia and some of the African, oil giants are in direct competition with each other. So there's that. Also, like a close relationship with Russia in Africa has over the last 10 years at least, that always had been shorthand for corruption, and that has been very true in South Africa, because South Africa was an early adopter of this very close relationship with Putin, because during the Zuma era, in South Africa's kind of pivot away from traditional Western partners towards new partners, it wasn't just a close relationship with China, it was also a very close relationship with Russia, but that relationship was marked by corruption on a different level than the South African relationship with China. And it's become like having that close relationship with Putin particularly has become shorthand in South Africa for some of the Zuma administration's corruption. So that adds another kind of mystifying wrinkle to all of this. Kind of this why embrace this partner that has shown itself in the past to have been not a very trustworthy partner.
Let's quickly look at this from the Russia-China angle. And I wrote an article on our website that got quite a bit of attention from folks in Washington and Beijing. And again, this is the type of thing that we're generating on our site for our subscribers and those that subscribe to the China-Africa Project. The Russia-Africa Summit in Sochi sounded an awful lot like a China-Africa Summit. And it was interesting because I did a little bit of an analysis of Putin's keynote speech. And he was bringing in a lot of themes that we've heard before from the Chinese. So instead of saying win-win, which is the Chinese propaganda line for how it conducts its foreign policy, Putin said he is fostering, and this is a quote, mutually beneficial partnerships. Sounds very similar. He even used the words "no strings attached," That was a key part of it, that we're going to give aid and investment with no strings attached. That's, of course, a word that is long identified with the Chinese engagement strategy in Africa. He talked about how they want to end the dollar dominance. And here's his quote: to reduce the share of the dollar and switch to other currencies for mutual settlements. That, of course, has been part of the Chinese agenda to internationalize the yuan and to break the dollar hold, particularly in Africa. And in Nigeria, the yuan is part of the reserve basket, along with a number of other countries. And finally, he said he's going to talk about state-led infrastructure diplomacy. So he said, we, of course, will provide support at the state level. That, of course, again, is right out of the Chinese playbook as well. Not the private sector, but state-led engagement in Africa. So I think in some ways it was interesting to see how Russia, in many ways, is copying, being inspired, whatever you want to call it, the Chinese model. And in some ways, it does show the increasing popularity of the Chinese model, particularly among another power like Russia. What's your thought on that?
Yeah, no, I mean, it's very interesting. It does certainly show how China has, I think, shaped the vocabulary of African engagement. And China has, I think, also shaped this kind of anti-Westernism, as part of what it means to engage with Africa now as a non-Western partner. But at the same time, it's almost like to take a Russian metaphor, it's almost like the Russian version is like this Potemkin village version of the Chinese rhetoric, because in state-led infrastructure engagement, infrastructure diplomacy, and no strings attached policies and currency internationalization, all of those things, when China say it, they bring real economic muscle to that. There's meaning behind that, or like economic weight behind the idea that it might be useful for African countries to trade in RMB. Like, what is ruble internationalization going to bring Africa?
Nothing.
What kind of infrastructure can Russia really provide? It's like there's almost like this kind of play acting using Chinese language, which is interesting, but then also, what does it really mean in reality?
So, a compliment to the article that I wrote is an article that was written by Judd Devermont, who is the head of the Africa program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington. That's one of the big think tanks inside the Beltway there. And I'm going to quickly run through his 5 recommendations for how the United States should respond to the Russians and the Russia-Africa summit. Number 1, the U.S. should act before the Russians. Washington can preempt or at least minimize opportunities for Russian engagement by getting more involved in those countries Moscow is likely to approach. Number 2, the U.S. should work rhetorically to isolate, not elevate, Russia's profile in America. Moscow isn't a big player on the continent, so don't call them a great power. That is an instinct that Americans like to do, in particular because the military-industrial complex does like to kind of beef up its enemies in such a way so that to justify massive engagement on the military side. Number 3, he says the U.S. government should practice positive engagement with African countries. You and I have talked about that before, Cobus. Number 4, he says the U.S. should aggressively enforce UN and U.S. sanctions. Washington needs to make it clear that there's a price to be paid if African officials work with individuals or Russian agencies targeted by international sanctions. What's the interest for the African side to deal with Russia when the risks are so high? And finally, Judd's last point was the U.S. government should challenge Russian propaganda efforts on the continent. So RTV and the very formidable Russian social media enterprise will probably start to show its face in Africa. And again, I'm not entirely sure African countries are equipped to deal with the Chinese, the Russians, the heavy propaganda that's coming in all the different ways, just because these are very, very sophisticated operations that are coming in. So those are his 5 points. Cobus, what's your reaction in terms of what Judd said, how the U.S. should respond to this?
Well, I mean, I tend to agree with Judd's points. I think the only thing I would add is that the entire situation is complicated by the fact that I think the U.S. is itself coming from such a complicated position in relation to Russia at the moment, because obviously, officially, from a State Department perspective, Russia is a big problem. But then within the White House, the relationship with Russia is a lot more complicated. And the Trump-Putin relationship adds a kind of a wild card aspect to all of this, kind of which I think makes it harder for the US to respond in a concerted manner. For me, the more fundamental question is, goes back to the one that we raised before. It's like, why is the West-Africa relationship so broken? What needs to be unpacked in that relationship that is fueling these kind of gestures, particularly the gestures that don't seem to be bringing Africa really very many concrete gains.
So all of that is on our website. Judd's article, there's an article entitled With Africa-Russia Summit Kicking Off This Week. Judd Devermont has some advice for how the U.S. should respond. That's on our website. My article's on the website. We hope that you'll go check out ChinaAfricaProject.com. If you like what we've been talking about and you're really interested in these topics, then you're going to want to subscribe to the China Africa Project. I mean, it's a unique resource. We're very, very proud of it. We're bringing in all these diverse voices to comment on it. We've got some great African voices also commenting on the Russia-Africa relationship. And so this is something that you're going to want to check out. With your membership, by the way, your subscription, you'll get access to the website. You'll get our Africa-China Experts Network, which is a one-of-a-kind experts network. And, of course, the daily email China Africa Brief that Cobus and I send out every day. So that's the kind of a sampling of what we're going to do on there. So, Cobus, okay, we'll leave it there for now. I suspect that Russia is going to be a topic that we are going to pick up again before the end of the year. Putin is not the kind of guy who goes away quietly. It's not like the Americans, I think, who came out with this big Prosper Africa thing, and then we really haven't heard much from the Americans on Prosper Africa. Something tells me we're going to be hearing about the Russians through the course of the year. I don't get the sense that he's going to go quietly into the night. So that'll do it for this edition of the China in Africa podcast. Cobus and I will be back again next week with another episode. Until then, thank you so much for listening.
The discussion continues online. Head over to facebook.com/China Africa Project to share your thoughts on today's show. The guys are also on Twitter, where you can find Kobus at Studinsky or Eric at eOlander. And be sure to sign up for the weekly China in Africa email newsletter by going to www.ChinaAfricaProject.com.